Before becoming king, the future Edward I of England fulfilled his vow of going on crusade to the Holy Land. Sometimes called the Ninth Crusade, this would also be the last crusade to reach the Holy Land before the fall of the city of Acre and the end of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Join me on Footnoting History to learn more about Lord Edward's crusade. First, let's take a step back from our friend Edward and talk about crusades. What is a crusade? Some scholars have declared that any attempt to define the Crusades is too limited, and that any Christian war fought for God could be a crusade. A second school of thought argues that the Crusades should be defined by the piety and belief of the peasantry and other non-nobles. In this instance, it is the believers who matter. Some historians believe that we can consider something a crusade if it was either headed to recover Jerusalem for the Christian world or to defend Jerusalem. In other words, location matters. Finally, there are the historians who look not at who or where, but how an operation was initiated and organized and ask the question, did the participants take a Crusader vow? One question we can ask ourselves about what made a crusade was, how did contemporaries recognize a crusade? There are a few indicators. First, participants were called to take the cross, which meant making a vow to join a military expedition with defined aims and physically attaching a cloth cross to your chest until the expedition was over. Of course, this gets a bit murky when we consider that there were more than just crusaders on a crusade, such as hangers-on, camp followers, women, and even children. In any case, those taking the cross answered a call that could only be made by the Pope. Because of the vows they made, crusaders gained privileges and received indulgences, suggesting that a necessary element of crusading was penitential. Then there is the question of Christianity's use of force, and how to square the two. So we get a theory of just war, in which it still is acknowledged that violence is evil, but in certain circumstances war may be condoned by God as the lesser of two evils. This harkens back to St. Augustine and the determination that war must have a just cause, be proclaimed by legitimate authority, and all participants must have correct intention or pure ambition. These were the rules for a crusade. By the time Edward took the cross, there had been numerous declared crusades, beginning with what would later be called the First Crusade in 1096. The First Crusade was preached by Urban II following an appeal by Alexius I of Constantinople for aid against the Turks. Urban personally preached the crusade, calling for both the liberation of people, those baptized in the Eastern Church, especially in Jerusalem, and liberation of places, like the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. War was deemed justifiable to reclaim Christian territory. At the same time as the First Crusade was ramping up, there were very weak political figures in the East, allowing for minimal resistance. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, who of course believed it to be divine intervention. With the capture of the holiest of cities in the Christian faith, there became a new justification for the Crusades. Holy Land that was now in Christian hands had to be defended. Unfortunately, we cannot do the entire crusading period justice in this episode, or we will never get to Edward. By Edward's time, Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187, and although it was retaken by Christians again from 1229 to 1244, it was back in Muslim hands after that. In fact, as we shall see, much of the Holy Land was no longer in control of the Christians by the time Edward took the cross. For more information on the Crusades, check out the brief reading list on the Footnoting History website. Now that we have gotten a little taste of what the Crusades were, what about our main character, Edward? Of course, at the time of the Ninth Crusade, Edward was not yet king, as his father Henry III remained on the throne, and was usually referred to as Lord Edward, so that is what we will call him. Lord Edward was the eldest son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, and a member of the infamous Plantagenet family. He was born in 1239 and given an odd name for an aristocrat descended from William the Conqueror and the line of Norman kings, since Edward was an Anglo-Saxon name. Henry III was a deeply pious man and had adopted Edward the Confessor, the last reigning king from Wessex, an Anglo-Saxon and saint, as his role model and hero, hence the name of his eldest son. Little is known of Edward's upbringing, although he was supposedly a sickly child. At the age of 15, he married 13-year-old Eleanor of Castile, who was the half-sister of King Alfonso X of Castile. This arranged marriage was to help prevent a possible invasion of the English-held province of Gascony by Alfonso. Lord Edward's early biography is fascinating and filled with intrigue and endless warfare. I, unfortunately, do not have time to dive further into Edward's early life, but if you want a taste, I highly recommend 2 earlier episodes by fellow podcaster Christine on Simon de Montfort. De Montfort was an oversized part of Edward's early years. In Footnoting History archives, check out Simon de Montfort Revisited from August 16, 2025, and How Simon de Montfort Earned a Relief in the House of Representatives from 2014. Now back to Lord Edward and his crusade. The idea of an English crusade had been percolating in the minds of the English nobility since at least the mid-1250s. Henry III longed to go on crusade, or at least made it seem like he did so, and over his life would declare his intention to go to the Holy Land 3 different times. However, matters at home, in the form of constant warfare with the Welsh and trouble with an old friend of the show, Simon de Montfort, over the previous decades, had left him little time to journey east. Even when in 1263 the Pope called for a new crusade to the Holy Land, it fell on preoccupied ears in England. Crusades were arduous and long and obviously deadly, and if your house wasn't at least mostly in order, there was the very strong risk there wouldn't be much of a house to return to. So for all his piety, Henry never took his crusade, leaving it up to his eldest son Edward to achieve what his father could or would not. The idea of Edward going on crusade seemed ludicrous to many. Having very recently established at least a modicum of stability in England, as the heir to the king, Edward's departure seemed to many like a bad idea. In 1268, the Pope, knowing full well Henry III's desire to go on crusade and Edward's eagerness, suggested that perhaps Henry's younger son, Edmund, fulfill his father's vow. But Edward had a stubborn streak and was more determined than ever to go to the Holy Land. It has been suggested that besides his own desire, he was heavily influenced by Louis IX of France, who had led the Seventh Crusade and was planning to return, and had a friendly relationship with the young Edward. By at least 1267, Edward had resolved to go, and a year later, on June 24, 1268, Edward, Edmund, and their cousin Henry of Almaine took the cross. They were to join with Louis IX, who was currently planning for his second crusade. It was at this time that Edward's wife Eleanor decided to accompany him. While that might sound a little odd to modern ears, spouses accompanying their significant other to war was not unheard of when that war was a crusade. And as it turned out, if later legends are to be believed, it was good that Eleanor decided to go. After the initial decision to go on crusade, the largest issue was funding the venture. Crusades were expensive, and by the time of Edward's decision, those who wished to go were basically required to self-fund the expedition. A knight or noble's main source of income was their estate, so these were often sold or at least mortgaged to gain sufficient funds. The church would also provide loans in some instances, but Edward was unable to obtain financial assistance from the church. Luckily, Louis IX came through, providing Edward a loan of £17,000. Although this was well received, it was not enough to fully fund Edward's crusade. Back in England, there continued to be much dissatisfaction with the idea of the crusade and who was going to pay for it. Following the internal warfare between Henry III and Simon de Montfort during the Second Barons' War, the knights who had fought for de Montfort, and so were on the losing side, were already being made to pay for their rebellion. Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, was the leader of the dissatisfied group, even though he had also pledged to go on the crusade. Finally, after debate and hand-wringing, at the Easter Parliament in 1270, the monetary issues were resolved, as were the disputes between Edward and Gilbert. By this point, the agreed-upon deadline for meeting up with Louis IX was fast approaching. So with contracts finally settled and around 200 knights and their attendants, for a total of about 1,000 travelers, the English finally set sail for France in August 1270. By the end of September, the entire force had reached southern France and were prepared to join forces with the French. However, when the English arrived, they discovered that Louis had left months ago and had actually traveled south towards Egypt rather than east to Acre and the Holy Lands. This last-minute change of plans from Louis was due to his brother's insistence. The brother, Charles of Anjou, had successfully taken the kingdom of Sicily and crowned himself king. He then convinced his brother to direct his crusaders to Tunis in North Africa rather than the Holy Land. Why Tunis? Because the emirs of Tunis had long paid a tribute to the kings of Sicily, and those payments had lapsed. There was also a rumor, perhaps started by Charles himself, that the current emir of Tunis was possibly eager to convert to Christianity, an enticing element to the very pious Louis IX. Due to their initial agreement and the large loan that Louis had given him, Edward felt obligated to follow the French king to North Africa rather than his original destination. So in October, Edward finally set out. Unbeknownst to Edward, Louis had already died months before in August, only days after the English had left England. Plague had struck North Africa, killing many of the French crusaders, including their king. Before this unfortunate turn of events, Charles of Anjou had been able to get promises of payment from the emir, so that by November, when Edward finally arrived, the French expedition was over, and they were prepared to head home. No emirs had been converted to Christianity in the process. After all this preparation and financial commitment, not to mention his genuine desire to complete the crusade, Edward was appalled by this complete change of events. Nevertheless, having few options, he agreed to return to Sicily with Charles before making any final decisions regarding his next move. An intervention of seemingly divine influence helped Edward make that decision. Having docked in Sicily, the fleets of both the English and French were subjected to a terrible storm. The French fleet was practically destroyed, causing the new French king Philip III, son of Louis, to abandon any impulse to return to the Holy Land and instead head back to France. The English fleet was spared. Edward saw this as divine approval, and in the spring finally set sail for Acre. It had been 170 years since the first Crusaders came to what they called Outremer, or the lands beyond the sea, and much had changed since then. The Crusaders had originally conquered a long strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean, and over the initial decades that area had slowly expanded. However, due to concerted efforts over the ensuing years by Muslim sultans and generals, the outward expansion of the Christian territory was stifled. In 1187, Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin, Sultan of Egypt, and although recovered briefly in 1229, by the time of Edward's crusade the city had been permanently lost to the Christians, and the kingdom was now ruled from Cyprus, with Acre as the last remaining Christian stronghold on the mainland. There had been relative stability in the region, if not peace, for many years. However, with the rise of a new power within the Muslim world, the Mamluks, the status quo had ended. The Mamluks were originally enslaved elite warriors who, following enslavement, converted to Islam. While their full background story is too long to tell in this episode, by the mid-1200s, the first Mamluk dynasty took over in Egypt. When Edward and his forces arrived, the Mamluk Baybars had been sultan for a decade. He had risen to power as a strong and able general, and his defeat of the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 helped cement his reputation. He was also determined to push the Christians once and for all out of the region. This was the situation when Edward and the English arrived in Outremer. Acre was the last remaining city in the hands of the Crusaders, Caesarea and Antioch having fallen a decade earlier. Hearing of Edward's arrival, Baybars, who was in the process of the early stages of laying siege to Tripoli, changed his plans and headed to deal with the English. Arriving in Acre in June, Baybars quickly attacked and took the nearby castle of Montfort. This was the headquarters of the Teutonic Knights, a military holy order like the Templars and Hospitallers. This was Baybar's second attempt at taking the castle, and this time he succeeded. The remaining knights were allowed to leave and went to Acre. Having taken the castle of Montfort, and making sure Edward and all the Crusaders in Acre were well aware of his large army, which vastly outnumbered what the Christians could put into the field, Baybars withdrew his forces, content to rely on intimidation. After a number of months in Acre, Edward grew impatient and led a raid into Muslim territory, seizing and destroying crops, and killing some local residents. A strategic and moral victory it was not. It was now becoming clear to the future King of England that he needed allies, if he were to accomplish anything remotely close to what his ancestor Richard I had achieved almost 100 years earlier. Edward focused his energies on securing these allies, including the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the King of Jerusalem. All eventually, and reluctantly, agreed to help. It was also at this time that Edmund, Edward's younger brother, finally arrived, bringing extra knights and soldiers. Still, even with all the Christian forces, Edward remained vastly outnumbered by Baybars and the Mamluks. But Edward had one final ace up his sleeve. When he had first arrived in the region, he had dispatched 3 messengers to Abaka Khan, the ruler of the Khanate, a part of the Mongol Empire, in what is now Iran. The Mongols had risen at the beginning of the 13th century and very quickly built a vast empire, stretching from China to the fringes of Europe. In the 1250s, they turned their attention to the Middle East, confronting the Islamic forces, culminating in the decisive Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. This battle marked a significant defeat of the Mongols at the hands of the Mamluks, and ended their expansion into the Middle East. However, even with this defeat, the Mamluks were well aware of the continued threat the Mongols posed to them, and any potential alliance between the Christian Crusaders and the Mongols was taken very seriously. The journey to the heart of the Khanate took Edward's emissaries months. However, the response was well worth the wait. Abaka Khan agreed to join forces with Edward and asked when the coordinated attack would take place. By the time the response had reached Edward, the Mongol forces were already in motion, having driven the Mamluks out of Aleppo and were now only 200 miles from Acre. Baybars immediately gathered his warriors and headed to meet the new threat. Seeing their opportunity, Edward and his crusaders rode out of Acre to Cocoon, a village and a castle 40 miles south of Acre and about halfway to Jerusalem. The Crusaders successfully defeated a much weaker force of locals, but they were not successful in laying siege to the castle. Discovering Baybars was already on his way back, the Crusaders returned to Acre. It turned out there had been no fighting between Baybars and the Mongols, who had retreated before the Mamluks had even arrived, needing to deal with more pressing issues in other parts of their empire. By early December, Baybars had retaken Aleppo. Having heard of Edward's inability to take the castle at Cocoon, Baybars is alleged to have said that if so many men cannot take a house, it seems unlikely that they will conquer the kingdom of Jerusalem. Edward seems to have come to a similar conclusion at this point, though it was not what he had hoped for. Since arriving in the region, Edward had been eager for battle, and just as eager to stay away from the usual course of events in the region, which usually resulted in some type of truce between the Muslims and the Christians. Nevertheless, it was clear that there were simply not enough warriors to fight against Baybars, particularly when he was at full strength. The dashed hopes of an alliance with the Mongols also must have weighed heavily on Edward. In April 1272, the decision to keep fighting or not was taken out of his hands, following the signing of a 10-year truce between Baybars and the King of Jerusalem, Hugh III of Cyprus. Edward's crusade, it seemed, was over. There was one final incident that is worth telling. According to Muslim sources, Baybars ordered one of his men to pretend to be ready to betray the Sultan and offer his services to Edward. Why hatch this plot? It turns out Edward was not fully on board with the new 10-year truce, and had declined to sign on. He certainly wasn't in any position to continue to wage any sort of productive war against Baybars, but even having a small thorn in his side seemed to be enough of a reason for the Mamluk Sultan to try a different tactic to rid himself of Edward. Muslim messengers arrived at Edward's court with gifts and were subsequently allowed to stay on. On June 17th, one of these messengers secured a private meeting with alleged information about Baybars. It is clear that Edward was not satisfied with the 10-year truce, and while he must have been aware of his inability to inflict much damage on Baybars due to his lack of men, he was not yet ready to give up. What Edward thought he might learn, I don't know, but in any case he felt it worth allowing for the private meeting. Now alone with Edward and his interpreter, the man drew a dagger and stabbed Edward. Although shocked by this turn of events, Edward was able to fight back and ended up killing his attacker. Unfortunately, the wound was quite serious, and many in Edward's retinue feared it might be poisonous. Now legend has it that Eleanor, Edward's wife, who had accompanied him on the crusade, rushed to her husband's side and sucked out the poison, thus saving his life. Unfortunately for us romantics, this is likely a much later addition to the tale, as the first time it appears in writing is 100 years later in an Italian chronicle. What actually happened was a little less dramatic. The wound was definitely quite serious and turned gangrenous so that the flesh surrounding it had to be cut away and the infection would not spread. At the moment, this seemed to have saved Edward's life, but if it were to properly heal, it would take some time, and Edward decided it was time to return to England. In September, Edward and the remaining Crusaders left Acre, arriving in Sicily in November. Due to the serious nature of his wound, Edward took his time traveling, deciding to stay in Sicily for Christmas. So it was while he was there that he received news that his father, Henry III, had died, and Edward was now King of England. Was there anything of importance in this ill-fated crusade to the Holy Land, or was it truly just a footnote of history? For one thing, it was clear that the power in the region had shifted to the Mamluks, and without a concerted effort from the kingdoms of Europe, the full extent of the Kingdom of Jerusalem would never recover. In fact, 20 years later, Acre finally fell to the Mamluks, the last major stronghold of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For his part, Edward returned to England as the new king. Although he had failed in the quite unrealistic expectation of retaking Jerusalem, he had fulfilled his vow of going on crusade, something neither his father nor his grandfather, King John, had done. One fortuitous event did occur during Edward's time away from England, although it was not while he was in Acre. On Edward's return trip, after his time in Sicily, he traveled to France, spending some time in the country of his mother's relatives, the Savoys. Of particular note is Edward's stay at Count Philip's castle near the city of Lyon. It was here that Edward was likely introduced to a young architect and designer of castles, who would later be known as Master James of St. George. James and his father had been selling their services to various nobles in France and Italy, constructing castles in the region. However, in 1275, James disappears from the records of Savoy and does not reappear again until 1278. this time in the employ of Edward. His task? To build castles in Wales. Thank you for joining me for Lord Edward's Crusade. Don't forget to head over to footnotinghistory.com for further reading suggestions related to everything we discussed today. We're glad you're here. And remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.